it's me, Ovary Actor. Today we will continue the discussion on Section 2.2 of the WFTDA Rulebook. Section 2.2 states, when a jam begins, the jammers must be touching on or behind the jammer line. Blockers must all be behind the pivot line, ahead of the jammer line. And all non-pivot blockers must not be touching the pivot line. If either pivot lines up touching the pivot line at the jam start, all non-pivot blockers must be behind that pivot's hips. Okay, here we have scenario C2.2.D. All white blockers, including white pivot, line up legally between jams at the pivot line, but not touching the line. Red pivot lines up behind them. Immediately before the jam starts, red pivot reaches forward with their leg and places their skate on the pivot line. So let's look at this. We will have all white blockers. Oh, what was that noise? All the white blockers are lined up at the pivot line, but not touching it. Okay. And then immediately before the jam starts, so they say 5 seconds, and then right before the jam whistle starts, red pivot, maybe she was over here, and she's like, what? And she comes through, and she just sticks her leg right through that wall to where she would be touching the pivot line. Okay, this doesn't really let me show that very easily. So what would happen in that situation? The outcome. The white non-pivot blockers should all be issued a false start warning and must yield their positions to all nearby skaters. Any who do not yield should receive a penalty. So when that happens, she quickly puts her foot right there. They've got to yield. These 3 blockers right here have to yield to her or any other nearby skaters. Right? So the pivot, the white pivot, doesn't have to yield because white pivot also has the freedom to touch that line, right? So if they do not yield, they would be issued a penalty, okay? And it'll typically be probably this referee, the outside pack referee, or this referee, the inside pack referee, that would be able to see that false start, possibly this guy or girl. Okay, the rationale, red pivot established their position in contact with the pivot line before the beginning of the jam. So non-pivot blockers must begin the jam behind the hips of any pivots in contact with the pivot line. All white blockers began the jam in front of the red pivot, so all but the white pivot are required to yield. Okay, so keep that in mind and don't leave your team shorthanded. Follow the rules.